Okay, this particular video is one that is a long time coming. It's one that needed to be done. It's actually many years in the working in that it should have been done by other people. Unfortunately, it hasn't been. The reason why I'm doing it is because as a black Muslim, it has always been the case that black nationalists, Islamophobes, white Islamophobes, have always attempted to make black Muslims like myself feel like we were foolish for being Muslim. And much of this came from the idea that black people were second class Muslims. Now, much of that impression, or much of the reason for that impression, comes from Arabs. Not all Arabs. Two of my very best friends that are like brothers to me are Arab. I, by the way, do not refer to Palestinians as Arabs any longer because of the betrayal of them by other Arabs. But much of the lies that we see in the Islamic community come from different sources. And quite frankly, it does come from many Arabs. The fact that there is information that should have been put out many years ago, should have been put out not only by Arabs, but also by black Muslims, and particularly the group called the Salafi of Newark, the Salafi of New York, the Salafi of Philadelphia, the Salafis of Birmingham, the Salafis of Liverpool, the Salafis of Manchester, black Muslims who know this information, or should know this information, should a long time ago have put this information out. It needs to be said that black people in Islam were some of the most revered Muslims in Islamic history. I will say again, it needs to be said that black Muslims, Muslims of African ancestry, for one, and Muslims who would be considered to be Afro-Arabs, extremely dark Muslims, extremely dark Arabs, generally from the Hijaz area of Arabia as well as from Yemen, but very dark in color. These particular people were some of the most revered people in the history of Islam. In this particular video, I'm going to start to rectify a major issue in the Islamic community, and that is understanding the place of black Muslims in Islamic history. We're going to look here at four phases of African resentment in Islamic history, or in the history of Muslims. Okay? When we talk about Islamic history, it's different than the history of Muslims. Muslims are people who do what they do, whether it's Islamic or not. And I don't think that Islam should be blamed for what some Muslims do, no more than Christianity should be looked down on based on the savagery and the barbarism that people who call themselves Christians indulged in. So when I say Islamic history, what I mean is Muslim history, but I will try to stick to just making sure I'm talking about Muslim history. But we want to look at four phases in the history of Muslims, okay, of African resentment. Now, understand, I'm not talking about racism. Okay? I'm not talking about racism. I'm talking about resentment. And when this video is over, you'll understand why I'm using the term resentment and not racism. Because it wasn't about race. It was about resentment on the part of Arabs in the direction of people of African descent. So let's look at the first phase. The first phase. It is a myth that Africans were seen by Muslims in early Islam, it is a myth that they were seen as being inferior. This is an absolute myth that they were seen as being inferior. Why? Because during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there were four major powers. Four major world powers. I mean militarily, I mean in regards to having a navy, some of them had a navy. Four major powers in the world during the time of the Prophet Muhammad were Rome, China, Persia, and Ethiopia. So the Arabs during the time of Muhammad knew that Ethiopia was a major power. In no way did they ever believe that the African was inferior. This is a total misconception and misperception put forth by many Arabs, by black nationalists, and white Islamophobes. I'm going to repeat again. The four major powers, okay? During the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the four major world powers were Rome, Persia, China, and Ethiopia. In fact, Ethiopia was so powerful that when Muhammad's followers were when people were trying to kill them, they actually moved to Ethiopia, which was called Abyssinia at the time. So this idea that the early Muslims saw people of African descent as being inferior is a complete fabrication. Okay, so phase one of the resentment that many Arabs had of Africans is not based on them believing they were inferior. It is based on the fact that they resented them for being a major power. Now, as a major power, the Ethiopians were also Christian at that particular time. And they resented the fact that the Arabs, I was going to call them ancient, they resented the fact that the Arabs at that time were pagans. Because of that, the Ethiopians and the king of Ethiopians, the leader of the Ethiopians, the Negus of Ethiopia, he did attempt, in Islamic history and in the history of the Muslims, he did attempt to crush the Kaaba, the structure where these pagan idols are being held. Now, he wasn't successful in doing that, but again, that created resentment. The Arab did not resent the African of Ethiopia because they thought they were inferior. They were not racist because they thought they were inferior. They were resentful of them because of the power of Ethiopia and the fact that Ethiopia was a Christian empire that resented the pagan practices of the Arab. The second stage, or the second phase of African resentment on the part of the Arab came, and I want you to listen to this because this is what people are not talking about. This is what you have not been told. The second stage of resentment that Arabs felt for people of African descent came from the closeness that the Prophet Muhammad had with people of African descent. I'm going to say that again. The second stage of resentment that Arabs had in regards to people of African descent came about because of the Prophet Muhammad's closeness, because of his closeness to people of African descent. Two major instances in history need to be told. Two major instances in history. Most Arabs will not tell you this. Black nationalists do not know this, and if they knew it, they would try to deny it because it blows holes in their myth that black people or people of African descent were inferior in Islamic history. But I want to point out two particular instances in two events, very important events in the life of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. When he was ran out of Mecca and went to Medina, eventually he became powerful. He gathered up a military, and he went back to Mecca. Now, when he went back to Mecca not to massacre people, but he went back to again bring Islam to the pagans in Mecca. He rode in on a camel. Now, generally, when people rode on a camel, they would have one other rider. Rarely did people ride on a camel by themselves. They had someone who would ride on the back of the camel. It was a major deal when the Prophet Muhammad picked a person to ride on the back of his camel going into Mecca, going in victorious into Mecca. He knew what it would mean in history. He knew that it would be written down in history. His conquering of the tribes that attempted to kill him and ran him out of Mecca. He knew it would be a historical moment, and he chose Usama ibn Zayd. Usama ibn Zayd, the son of Zayd, a former Afro-Arab slave, and the son also of Ayman Baraka, the Ethiopian woman who raised Muhammad. Yes, the Ethiopian woman who raised Muhammad. He called her Ummi. His own mother died when he was 6 years old, and he was raised not by his uncles. He was protected and housed by his uncles, but he was raised from 6 years old by an Ethiopian woman that he called Ummi, which means mother in Arabic. Her name was Baraka, but she had a son named Ayman, so her kunya, or her name based on her being a mother of Ayman, was Ayman. Usama ibn Zayd was her son that she had by the Arab, who was an Arab, but he was from Yemen. So he was very dark. He looked like he was African, but he was an Arab, a pure Arab. Usama ibn Zayd was known to be Adam Shadidul Udma. Adam Shadidul Udma. He was jet black. And Muhammad rode in, had him ride on the back of Muhammad's camel with Muhammad when Muhammad conquered Mecca. A major historical event, and he picked a black teenager to ride on the back of his camel. Why? Because he referred to Usama ibn Zayd as his grandson. Usama ibn Zayd was seen as being the Prophet Muhammad's grandson and was one of the most revered of the early Muslims in all Islamic history. In addition to riding in and being loved by the Prophet Muhammad, that young black teenager was the youngest Muslim general, was the youngest general in Islamic history. That young black teenager, Usama ibn Zayd, was the youngest general in Islamic history. Led a force, some people say, of 10,000 men. Some people say of 100,000 men. But generally, most of the scholars say 10,000 men. Youngest general in history, Usama ibn Zayd, rode in on the back of Muhammad's camel when Muhammad went in, alayhi salam, when Muhammad went into Mecca and conquered Mecca. A major historical event. It brought Arab resentment. But the biggest event that brought on Arab resentment for people of African descent in early Islam is when Muhammad conquered Mecca. He went to the Kaaba and he started to smash the idols of the pagan. He started to smash the idols of the pagan, but he took two people in. Two people went into the Kaaba with him to smash these idols. One was the young black teenager, Usama ibn Zayd. And the other one was Bilal ibn Rabah, another Ethiopian former slave, set free by Abu Bakr, the first caliph of Islam, and a close friend and confidant of the Prophet Muhammad. 2 black men were taken into the Kaaba. While the Arabs heard them smashing their idols, they knew Muhammad had only taken 2 people, and both of these people were of African descent. Both of them. And it is a fact, and it is a historical fact, that outside of the Kaaba, many of the rich Arabs, many of the richest people of the Quraysh tribe were extremely angry because 2 of these people who were taken in and smashing their idols at the command on the orders of the Prophet Muhammad were not from their tribe. Were not from their tribe. And at least one parent of these people smashing those idols, at least one of them were Ethiopian. And they were both black, jet black, Adam Shadidul Udma, exceedingly dark, and both considered to be of African ancestry. Major events. 2 major events. One of them, where a black teenager is on the back of the camel coming into Mecca, riding in front of him on the same camel is the Prophet Muhammad. And the other event, major event, is when Muhammad goes into the Kaaba to smash the idols of the pagan Arab. He takes 2 black members of early Islam. One, a black teenager who becomes the youngest general in Islamic history, and the other one, Bilal ibn Rabah, the first caller to prayer, a confidant of the Prophet Muhammad salam, and someone who the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was known to love exceedingly. The third stage in African resentment, where the Arab resented people of African descent. The third stage, it comes after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, comes after the death of the first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. After the death of Ali, mostly with Yazid ibn Muawiyah, Yazid the son of Muawiyah. This is 32 years, maybe 32, 40 years after the death. So not long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Yazid, a leader of the Muslims at that time, is a known alcoholic and womanizer. A known alcoholic and womanizer. And at that time, some of the major opponents of these hypocrites were black scholars, people of African descent. Some of the major opponents of the hypocrite Arab leaders, some of the major opponents of the hypocrite Arab judges, some of the major opponents of the hypocrite Arab sheikhs or Arab so-called scholars, some of the major opponents happen to be people of African descent, telling them that what they were doing was not Islam, telling them that what they were doing was forbidden, it was haram, telling them that what they were doing was turning away from the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, telling them that what they were doing was turning away from the Quran. And this again brought resentment towards people of African descent from the Arab. The fourth and final stage, and the stage that we see today, is this embrace, well, the stage, and I want to say the fourth stage, the stage that we see today, not again by all Arabs, but by a great many of them, is this embrace of white, anti-black racism. Again, not all. Some of the most beautiful people I know are Arab, and I don't mean that to try to whitewash this or sanitize this particular video or make it less hard-hitting than what it is. I am saying it because it is true. I am not in any way saying that all Arabs are racist. The great majority of them are not. But there is a major problem in how many Syrians, there is a major problem in how many people from Iraq, There's a major problem in how other Muslims, people from Saudi Arabia, how other Muslims see black Muslims, and this video was going a long way in setting the record straight. Today, the fourth phase is one where these Arabs, people who haven't been Arabized, people who are not the original Arabs, people we see leading Saudi Arabia, people who we see leading Qatar, people who we see leading the United Arab Emirates, these particular people who are Arabized and are not the original Arabs, they have taken, many of them have taken on the same mantle, the same behavior, the same narrative, and the same ideology as the white racists of the West, and particularly the United States. This is a fact, and that is the fourth stage of African resentment on the part of Arabs. Now, there are many people who will say they don't like what I said. The fact of the matter is, it is true. And as a Muslim, I am commanded to enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. Enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. Talk about the facts. Tell the truth, even if the truth is against my own benefit. Even if means my demise, I have to tell the truth. And the truth of the matter is that Arabs, many of the Arabs in amongst the Muslim community today have embraced racism in much the same way as white racists have embraced it in the United States of America and in other places around the world. And that is the fourth phase. The fourth phase of African resentment on the part of the Arab. Okay? Number one was because one of the major powers was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, as a Christian nation, was in opposition to the Arab pagan. Number two, the great closeness and the great love that Muhammad had, alayhi salam, for people of African descent, so much so that the first family in Islamic history can be said to be of African descent. The first family in Islamic history, right? Not the first family that were Muslims, but the highest, the most revered family in Islamic history is actually the family of Zayd ibn Haritha. Okay? Zayd ibn Haritha. His family is the first family of Islamic history, in Islamic history, of course, after the family of the Prophet. But because of the love that Muhammad had for people of African descent, it brought out the animosity of many of the Arabs, and particularly the rich Arabs, the highfalutin Arabs, the most influential and powerful Arabs of the time at the time of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. The third phase was when the Arab leaders became corrupt and embraced corruption, and many of the knowledgeable people of African descent opposed them and let them know that what they were doing was against the Quran and the Sunnah, against the Quran, the Book of Allah, and the revelation brought to Muslims, but generally to all mankind, and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, what he said, what he did, what he looked like, and what he agreed to. The third phase is the phase the opposition of the scholars against the corrupt Arabs. The fourth phase, again, is the phase that we see today. And that particular phase is the phase where the Arab, who is Arabized, who is not the original Arab, these particular people took on the same mantle, took on the same ideology, took on the same narrative, and took on the same dirty heart of the white racists of the United States of America and of other places where there is anti-black racism. So they are the four phases of anti-black Arab resentment. We are not talking about racism. Racism in Islamic history is not there. It is not. There is resentment for people of African descent, but the idea that Africans were inferior is not something that you find in early Islam. What you see is resentment, and this resentment is not because black Muslims were inferior, but totally the opposite. In the next video, in this particular series, I will be talking about the Arab. And who is the Arab? What is an Arab? And what did the Arab look like during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who was not a white man. He was not an African man. There are people who say he's African. There were Afro-nationalists. There are nationalists who say he was an African man. He was not an African man. He was a Semite. He was an Arab. But he was quite likely my complexion. Quite likely my complexion, a wheat brown, which was generally the color of most Arabs during that time. Wheat brown, they went from a wheat brown to almost a purple black. But in the next video, I will be looking at the Arab. See you next video.